Hello and welcome to episode 17. I'm finally going to talk about the birds, and my cockatiel is going to make a lot of noise. Millions and millions of fans asked me, when are you going to talk about the birds? You mentioned that you had this idea about talking about the birds, and you haven't gotten around to it yet. That one of my fans in the other room, my cockatiel Hermes, is asking that right now. When are you going to talk about the birds? Well, most basically, I'm orienting my rainbow circle the wrong way. There you go, much better. Most basically, the thought experiment that I think is interesting to think about is why is the birds better than Birdemic? And I think that's one of those things we take for granted. We just look at the birds and say, well, that's beloved, cinematic masterpiece for so many reasons. And we look at Birdemic, which clearly is just imitating the birds, and it's one of the worst movies of all time, quote unquote, one of the worst movies of all time. And so the thought experiment is, why exactly can you come up with a good objective reason why Birdemic, I think Hermes really loves Birdemic and doesn't like the birds. Because he's being especially noisy. I did not plan that. He's being especially noisy right now. I don't know if it's even coming up on the video, but he's being very noisy right now. So why is Birdemic bad, quote unquote bad, and why is birds, quote unquote, so good? And this connects. I referenced these things a couple of different times. Like I was one episode, as my millions of fans know, one episode. I challenged the idea that political allegory is a universal good because, just as an example, some of the worst movies of all time have an environmental message, and Birdemic has it. If you ask the creator of Birdemic, he says, Mr. Nguyen, I forget his first name, but he says that the reason that the birds attack everybody is because of global warming, which is interesting, fascinating explanation. So just as a basic way of disproving that you could identify political allegory as a universal good, because is that the quality that makes Birdemic bad? Or is everything else bad about it, yet it has this political allegory that elevates it? Could you say, this is a valid response? I don't personally buy it, but you could make an argument that the political allegory is badly done, which, arguably it is. But I talked about that in the same discussion of why fixating on good and bad is the wrong fixation. That a lot of creative writing workshops will fixate on good and bad. A lot of reviews will fixate on good and bad. And I think the fixation on good and bad is the wrong sort of fixation, because there's such a complicated spectrum of personal good and bad that to just take for granted that everyone in the world will consider the birds good and everyone in the world would consider Birdemic bad is an oversimplification, an unhelpful oversimplification. Because somebody could find Birdemic good, I guess. It's utterly fascinating. The Birds is one of Hitchcock's most fascinating for many reasons, but Birdemic is fascinating for reasons other than perhaps the filmmakers really wanted it to be. And I talked a bit about good bad movies, what really makes quote-unquote good bad movies, and I think the whole existence of good bad movies demonstrates some of our really significant misunderstandings about that basic concept of what is good and what is bad. Is Birdemic bad based on some sort of universal standard of what good filmmaking is, and so it can never ever be entertaining or bring an audience pleasure? That's clearly not true. It's a cult movie. mostly because people laugh at its incompetence and things like that. So it has become an inadvertent comedy. But does that mean it's a failure as a piece of entertainment? It is very entertaining. So can you truly call it a failure of a piece of entertainment, even if it's inadvertently a great comedy? You can say that for pretty much every just classic good bad movie. Trolls 2, The Room, movies like that. Poorly made based on one standard. But are they actual failures? Are they actual creative failures? And that's I've mentioned how much I hate the cliche. You have to know the rules to break them. Which, if you're successful in creating something entertaining and stimulating, it's entirely irrelevant that rules even exist. There are rules in filmmaking that are long established, and good bad movies break them, but also Hitchcock breaks them all the time, just constantly. The rules, the quote unquote rules. Hitchcock knew the rules. He created great masterpieces, so that kind of that sort of thing tends to be evidence that you must know the rules to break them. But if Hitchcock can create this weird masterpiece in The Birds by breaking the rules, were the rules even necessary as part of the process? And I would say, that renders the whole concept that there are rules irrelevant. If you're a beginning filmmaker and you're just not familiar with, how movies work, that could be helpful. It's not a universal good. The rules of filmmaking are not a universal good. They're just, something helpful that you might know. Don't want to get too far off track. I'm running out of shirts, just to distract myself real briefly. I'm completely running out of shirts. This is episode 17. This helps me count how many shirts I actually have. I try to wear a different shirt each episode. It helps me keep track when I see the list of thumbnails, because the title is of the show is My Friend the Rainbow Circle, which takes up most of the space. So sometimes when it gets to My Friend the Rainbow Circle episode whatever, I can't really see it as I'm scrolling down. But this shirt reminds me, oh yeah, that was that episode. But this one's kind of faded and it's not a great shirt. I got it for free. It feels really indulgent to have 17 shirts. Just thinking of it in those terms. Most of them I got from Goodwill. I got this one for free. This is a whole other story, but this is a conference I went to, and it was very traumatizing. I hate conferences because I don't like large groups of people, and this one went really badly. So it was so traumatizing. I haven't been back to a conference since then. But I talked about Twitter fiction, and I talked about a lot of these same sort of things, and they were just very rude and terrible to me, and as I imagined it. I'm sure I exaggerated it, but so yes, very traumatizing. I could talk about this at more conferences, but it's a terrifying prospect. That's just if I did a Hitchcock movie, it would be called it wouldn't be called The Birds. It would be called Crowds. But anyway, AWP was an absolute nightmare. The one time I went, and I never went back. Where was I? So I'm getting myself distracted. So if you think about what actually qualifies as a universal good, The Birds is a fascinating one to really look at. And I think the direct comparison, I think the breakdown actually comes in this this third ring. Level 1. So just to go back to explaining, also I meant to mention the reason I wore this is the bridge in Falls Park in Greenville, South Carolina, where this conference was. But it reminds me of San Francisco, or Birdemic. Birdemic is set in San Francisco, if I remember correctly. And The Birds is set in Bodega Bay, I think it's Bodega Bay. But San Francisco type of area. I don't know California very well, so I can't say for sure. It reminds me, the shirt reminds me of San Francisco. So I think the breakdown is in the schematic level. So if you break down the first three rings of the of the rainbow circle, the center is the visceral stimulation. So what is successful about both the birds, and this is something that taking for granted that the birds is always good to every person, and Birdemic is always bad to every person. Um, it obscures what's actually successful about both of them. Why would somebody still rewatch a really bad movie like Birdemic? It's still stimulating on the visceral level. The birds is genuinely quite scary. I talked about before how I watch so many horror movies that it's harder to get scared by a horror movie anymore, unfortunately. But the birds is a scary movie that holds up just over the years. So what's really enjoyable about the birds is right in that core, that center of the visceral stimulation. It's successfully able to elicit fear. Birdemic does not successfully elicit fear, arguably. I'm sure somebody... It is entirely possible. I do want to be open and say it is entirely possible someone somewhere maybe might watch Birdemic and be scared by it. Possibly. I don't want to dismiss that possibility. But it's viscerally stimulating for most people who enjoy watching good bad movies like that. Good bad movies. It's viscerally stimulating because it's funny. And I talked about this before, like the pretense of it. I mean, the whole idea that somebody's trying to remake The Birds and everything about it is completely failing. On every technical thing about the whole movie is completely failing. That becomes funny. I don't really love laughing at good bad movies, just on a personal level, because I feel bad for the creators. I like enjoying good bad movies. I don't always like enjoying calling them bad, but that's a personal thing. But most people, I think, who really enjoy watching Troll 2, and Troll 1, I always like Troll 1, with Sonny Bono and Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and it's fascinating. I find it more fascinating than Troll 2, actually. But that's another topic. Not to get distracted. Or The Room, for example. People laugh at Tommy Wiseau and just how weird he is. I don't like laughing at Tommy Wiseau. But he is a fascinating, strange person. So it's a very compelling movie because of the strangeness of it. And that's true of Birdemic, and that's true of The Birds. The Birds is a very strange movie, and fascinating for very different reasons. But genuinely scary. So, you have that at the center. Most of the time when it's a narrative, a big part of the visceral stimulation comes from empathetic experience with the characters. And that's one of the fascinating issues with The Birds. And a lot of this is entirely personal. But I think Tippi Hedren's character, Melanie, much of the beginning of the movie sets up Melanie as a less sympathetic character. And I think that's a big source of why, just among Hitchcock movies, a lot of people don't rank The Birds as the highest. A lot of people love The Birds, but they'll rank Psycho and Vertigo and movies like that, North by Northwest or what have you. They'll rank other Hitchcock movies higher, and I think the big source of that, Birds is arguably scarier than any of those. So in terms of just horror and all that sort of stuff, I think it's, the schoolhouse scene alone is arguably, I mean, that Psycho might have been ruined just by being so famous, but the schoolhouse scene alone is like one of the scariest Hitchcock scenes. And this is entirely subjective, of course, but I'm just saying, just on principle, I think a big obstacle in people in people loving The Birds as much as some of those others is that Melanie Daniels is, a lot about her is really cold, and a lot about her is really less likable. I don't know if that's the performance or the writing or what it is, but um, just the plot right in the beginning. She meets Mitch, and she meets Mitch, and Mitch kind of picks on her and makes fun of her and knows her, some famous antics that she's gotten herself into, and she wants revenge by playing this practical joke that ends up it doesn't actually make any sense. So a lot of her motivation is kind of muddled. She wants to drive a couple hours to Bodega Bay, which I think is what it's called, um, and give him some lovebirds as a joke. Um, so I think a lot of the empathy gets lost in that starting point. It's it conceivably it's a cruel thing that she's just a big part of her motivation is to play a joke. The implication is that she's got a big crush on this guy she just met, who's just been mean to her. Uh, so what's really empathetic about Melanie, and just as a performer, that a lot of the performance is really cold. Yeah, and a lot of this is really subjective, of course. And so once the bird attack starts, a much more sympathetic character might have elicited more worry for her safety. And then you compare that to something like Psycho. I mean, the structure of the story is a similar sort of bait and switch structure, and you hear a lot of like creative writing workshop prescriptive concepts of what story structure should be, like a consistency of what the story is about from beginning to end. And both Psycho and the Birds just switch up what the story is completely at the a third of the way in, or half of the way in. Spoiler alert, I guess, for some of the most famous movies ever. But so Janet Leigh, she does something bad. She's not. She steals money. She's not. Her character's not 100% pure, but she's likable. She's in danger of being caught, and you connect with her, and you feel sorry feel sorry for her, and you want her to succeed even though she's doing something bad. But Melanie, there's really not much to attach to feel for her, so I think that's a big part of it. And just as a thought experiment, comparing the Birds and Birdemic, could somebody conceivably like Birdemic more than the Birds? And you kind of have to imagine a world, arguably. I mean, they're two most extreme. You could say, could you imagine a world where somebody likes Psycho more than the Birds, or somebody likes the Birds more than Psycho? I mean, they're close. They're so close in quality, but also public esteem, that it is conceivable. In Vertigo, add that. Could somebody like the Birds more than Vertigo? And I think it seems like the consensus is Vertigo's the best. Vertigo's great, but it's could you conceive of somebody liking the Birds more? I mean, they're fairly close in quality, so it's not as hard to imagine. But could you conceive of somebody liking Birdemic more than the Birds? And I think that's probably the area where conceivably somebody could like Birdemic more than the Birds. Not because the acting is great in Birdemic, but you have the character of Natalie is fascinating and strange. It's like the love interest of the main guy. The main guy is kind of flat and uninteresting, but Natalie seems, especially Birdemic 2. There is a sequel to that for some reason. Natalie has a strange sort of quality. I mean, the acting's not, you don't watch that for the great acting, of course, but Natalie has this fascinating quality of seeming like a decent, likable person caught in a terrible situation on two levels, one level of the terrible situation is she's fighting really bad special effect birds. The other level is she's caught in this really bad movie, um, and she's she's able to elicit sympathy. Um, like especially in Birdemic 2, you see her sort of fighting with the movie almost, sort of making fun of the movie and then trying to buy into it. There's a whole secondary arc with Natalie, though the actual arc is whatever, but she fights birds and she falls in love with this uninteresting guy or whatever. But the secondary arc is Natalie fighting to navigate this bad movie. Bad movie. So, if the thought experiment is, it's why really is the birds better than Birdemic. But is it conceivable that anybody could like Birdemic better than the birds? And probably on the level of character, it is conceivable. Natalie as a character, I think, is more sympathetic than because of those weird sort of layering, the meta layering, than Melanie is, and so that's the place where I think there's empathy. But if you look at the secondary level, the paradoxical level, where a lot of the character complexity comes in. So, on the most basic level, you have the danger that this character that you empathize with, you have the danger that he or she is in. And for Melanie, it's random bird attacks. For Natalie, it's non-dangerous bird attacks, but also the danger of this meta-level being trapped in a movie sort of empathy that you would have for her. But then on the paradoxical level, you add in, what is the flip side? So I think a lot of the attempt to make Natalie a really fascinating character, not Natalie, Melanie from the Birds, comes from the idea that she's this wild child. She has this reputation of swimming naked in a fountain and stuff like that, and she wants to be taken seriously. So, and I think that a part of the obstacle of doing that is just the motivation she has to go find Mitch. Her motivation is to play a joke, but she has these little speeches where she wants to be taken seriously, and it's Alfred Hitchcock's not always the best. It's based on a Daphne du Maurier story, but filtered through Alfred Hitchcock. Not always the best with female characters. So it's conceivable that could have worked really well for a character that that someone who has on the one hand has this public image of being sort of a party girl or whatever, wants to change her reputation and be taken seriously, what have you. That makes her compelling, and there's a lot of potential compelling qualities to the character that don't quite gel together. And then, but the other characters, like the mother is sort of a fascinating. I think Lydia is her name. The mother is a fascinating character. Who doesn't want her son to be consorting with this this girl with this bad reputation. Also, Melanie lacks a mother figure. I think that's the actual really fascinating arc of the whole character development of the movie, is the interaction between Melanie and Lydia. Lydia's really resistant to welcoming Melanie into her family or whatever. But by the end, they have this mother-daughter sort of bond that is communicated visually by just connecting with each other. That part of the character arc works a lot better. But then I would say what really works most effectively in terms of the fear in the movie is the schematic shifting, which is a concept that I think is most useful to really take from looking at comparing the birds and Birdemic. Schematic shifting. And you can look at Psycho, too. I mean, like, Psycho, I meant to mention also, Norman Bates is a fascinating example of that sort of paradox of, really empathetic character. Right when you meet Norman Bates, he's one of the most compelling characters. I mean, Janet Leigh is certainly a sympathetic character from the beginning, and you want her to succeed even if she's doing something bad. And then Norman Bates, you feel bad for him because he seems, controlled by his mother, and he seems very, shaky, but also creepy at the same time. So a lot of what's really compelling about him is in that second level. But then when you find out, he's the actual murderer, I think comparing I keep doing that. Comparing the birds and the Psycho on character level and comparing them on the schematic shifting level, but also comparing how the outer rim doesn't help necessarily with a narrative. It's the outer rim because it's the most destimulating end of the spectrum, the rational end of the spectrum where you explain why things happen. What's really effective about the birds, and the birds is essentially an absurdist story. I talked about how much I love Ionesco. Ionesco, the accumulation, the absurd accumulation is a story structure that is his specialty. Like with Rhinoceros, everybody turns into a rhinoceros. But I think what really makes all of those work really effectively is a match of the irrational absurd accumulation with a character you can really attach to. With Berenger, Berenger is one of my favorite characters, and most of the absurd accumulation stories, and I'm counting the chairs also, but most of the absurd accumulation stories feature Berenger as a character or somebody who's very much like Berenger. You feel for him and you want him to succeed, even though he's not always a great person. You still want him to succeed. You want him to live. You want him to survive and never turn into a rhinoceros or whatever. And the Birds has that sort of story structure too, where just randomly a seagull, I think it's the first one, if I remember correctly, attacks Melanie for no clear reason. And then that just ramps up. It accumulates absurdly. It ramps up until all of the birds are attacking people. And there's no explanation for it. It's a schematic shift because for the most part, the movie seems like a realistic story. It's kind of heightened, Hollywoodized version of reality. It is that sort of romance that you would get in the 60s, where you have the couple who meet and they have this misunderstanding and they have this quippy dialogue and they overcome their misunderstanding or whatever. So it seems like a fairly realistic romantic movie. There's overtones of something sinister happening, maybe, and just in a lot of the style choices. But then it takes a hard shift into a horror movie. And so it's one of the key points to keep in mind is that reality is a schema. So I talk about a lot of cliches that I do not like, and I would rather a cliche that I would like to replace all those other really bad creative writing cliches is that reality is a schema. So a lot of taken for granted concepts of what good and bad are hinge on this idea that reality is a universal good. So all stories are good because they're realistic, and so Birdemic must be bad because it's unrealistic. And that is a harmful perspective when it comes to development of stories. If you ever frame your advice to a young writer in terms of reality being the only good possible, and if you do something fantastical, it has to be metaphorical. Which Rhinoceros is not a great example because it is commonly interpreted as metaphorical for the rise of fascism. One of the reasons it's not my favorite one. But something like The Chairs, it's more imaginative. It's set in this post-apocalyptic world. All the rest of the world has died. It's set in this imaginary world. Or The Killer, it's set in this utopian. It starts off in this utopian world. So if you limit what is possible by saying it has to be realistic, and anything not realistic must be metaphorical, that severely limits the possibility of the types of stories that you can do, and you can do effectively, especially since metaphor can function, not always, but can function as a destimulating factor. So if in Birdemic, if the birds attacking is just standing in for the global warming attacking us back or what have you, that undermines the threat of the birds. Not that the birds were really threatening ever to begin with, but that undermines the threat of the birds. That rational explanation, or metaphorical explanation, undermines the threat of the birds. So it's much more effective to treat reality as a schema. So you start off the birds as this seemingly realistic story. So one schema is that it's set in present day reality of the time at least. One schema set in present day reality. So you set up the expectations of the reader that what's going to happen in the story is based on expectations of reality. If something breaks that, it can be a flaw. It can turn into a flaw like Birdemic, where the flaw is it foregrounds the mechanism, if you might call it, in postmodern terms. It foregrounds the mechanism, so it might be the boom mic or something like that takes you out of the reality schema, or the acting's really flat and unconvincing, so it takes you out of the schema of reality, and it becomes more like the humorous sort of schema break of Birdemic. But you can't make a universal rule that says if you start in reality, you must stay in reality, and you hear that a lot in creative writing advice. If you start in one mode, you have to stay there consistently, otherwise it's bad. It's not universally bad. It's just there is an effect to it. It can be an effect that you're aiming for. It could enhance the story if you shift that schema. It can harm the story if you shift that schema. And an example that I think a common example is Indiana Jones. When Indiana Jones 4 turned out to be about aliens, people got angry because Indiana Jones is not about aliens, which is a fascinating critique. I don't think that's the reason that Indiana Jones 4 fails creatively necessarily, that aliens show up. This is a series of movies that featured the Ark of the Covenant melting people's faces off, and a crusader living for 1,000 years or what have you, a couple hundred years, whatever it was, inside of a cave and protecting the Grail. I don't think reality is the issue there. I don't think shifting into sci-fi is necessarily a problem, but the false critique is that this is a story where shifting into sci-fi is unbelievable. There are plenty of unbelievable. There are plenty of other unbelievable things in that whole series, but it was just after 3 movies, it schematically sets up the reader for a particular type of supernatural force. Consistently over 3 movies, shifting into another type of supernatural force. That was schematic shifting, but it had the opposite of effect of what the filmmakers intended. So, schematic shifting is great storytelling technique, but it's just using it conscientiously on recognizing the sort of effect it will have. So if you have something like The Birds, and another bias, I meant to mention this too. I talked about cognitive biases that harm our understanding or block our understanding of how stories actually work. Like confirmation bias, a lot of our misunderstanding of what good actually means and what bad actually means. A lot of it comes from confirmation bias, but a bias that is really important to understand, just in shaping, especially the beginning of a story. If you think of the beginning of The Birds, what sort of cognitive bias is really governing that schematic shift? The cognitive bias there is anchoring bias. Anchoring bias just means that that you judge everything relative to the initial condition. So if you can see this like in the, if you go to the grocery store, you can see anchoring bias really easily. And a lot of these cognitive biases come up in economic arguments and things like that. But if you go to the grocery store and you see, I don't know, box of cereal is $3 and the box next to it is $2, you might say, well, that's cheap. But if you go into the grocery store and you see, your anchor is the $3 box. So you're judging everything after that relative to that first thing that you see. Doesn't mean it's actually cheap or actually expensive. It just means that you've anchored onto that one figure, basically. But if you go into a grocery store and you see a box of cereal for $4, and right next to that is a box of cereal for $3, then you say $3 is cheap. The actual conditions of whether or not it was cheap haven't changed at all. It's just the anchor has changed. So the anchoring bias is convincing our minds that the first thing we see must be the basic quality of the existence within the context. And it's very contextual. So if you, it's really relegated just to like the grocery store. It's relegated to just one story. So The Birds right at the beginning gives us the anchoring bias that this is a story about this kind of flighty woman who is flirting with this guy, takes the flirting to this weird extreme, and so maybe it will end up with sort of a conflict with his mother or his old girlfriends, Suzanne Plachette's character, for example. So most of the first part of the movie, it manipulates our anchoring bias. This is what this movie is about. And that's true with Psycho also. Psycho, famously, seems to be a crime story about Janet Leigh's character escaping with this money that she's stolen. And then it shifts into a story about Norman's mother's, presumably, from the first impression. Norman Bates' mother just suddenly murdering her in the shower, and then it shifts to Norman Bates dealing with that, and then it turns out it's Norman. So that's a massive schematic shift in both movies, and the halfway or the third mark, just I don't know, wherever it comes in the movie. A portion of the way through it, the story changes entirely. And that's something that can work well. I mean, I would say, a lot of the times when people see something like that and they say, well, that's really a fascinating structural experimentation, and they'll say most people can't get away with, but Hitchcock can, and Hitchcock's very good at things like this. Not the only two movies he does that in, but those are the two most famous that he does that in. Vertigo kinda. It kind of does change the plot. Vertigo changes so many times, but it kind of changes the plot in the middle. Uh, but people will say that, and it's sort of like you have to know the rules to break them. You have to be as good as Hitchcock in order to do something like that, and that's such a limiting perspective. And I always hate, one of the reasons I hate that phrase, you have to know the rules to break them, is the same reason why just saying only Hitchcock can pull off a middle of the story schematic shift. It's a daring thing to do. It's difficult to really pull off and do really well. But I would never identify that as something only elites are capable of. Only the greatest among us can pull off a schematic shift. You, as a beginning writer, must adhere to schematic consistency throughout the story. And it's such a way of shutting down possibilities, just like saying that reality is the universal good. If you treat reality as a schema, you could treat anything as a schema. You could treat anything as the initial condition of a story. This is why I like, hey, Bo. Bo is going to walk across the screen. Hi. Yeah, I wasn't doing. You don't understand what cameras are. I realize. Bo, come here. You don't understand what cameras are. I understand. Okay. This is a camera. You see yourself? You see the kitty? I could talk about Lacanian psychology now. Getting way off track. As the animals often get me off track. But what was I saying? You can treat anything as a schema. So this is why I love Cosmo Comics by Italo Calvino. He creates a very different schema. He creates a schema based on these scientific principles of all of these entities, whatever they are, being trapped in one space. And he creates this compelling story based on this radically different schema than anything we understand. So yeah, the schema of the birds starts off in reality, but it shifts into the supernatural, unexplained force attacking people. These birds. So schema's right here. And the schema, the important thing to remember about the schema is one other important thing. It's a source of comfort. So here at the center is the most discomforting part. Despite claims to the contrary, literature doesn't exist to comfort the discomforted and discomfort the comfortable. That's a ridiculous thing that has never, ever been true. It's the most uncomfortable. It's the most uncomfortable, viscerally stimulating. If you think of birds attacking, that's not comfortable. It's viscerally stimulating. And the outer rim, that's the most comforting part. It's the most destimulating part. Schema is a level of comfort that is a manipulable level of comfort that if you convince the reader or viewer or whatever that this is a romantic story, there's a level of comfort of the expectations of what's going to happen. So if you take the beginning of The Birds as a romantic story, well, I know, Mitch and Melanie, a cute couple name. Mitch and Melanie are going to end up together, and after overcoming misunderstandings, whatever else. There's a run to the airport. This might have predated the run to the airport cliche. So it sets up this level of comfort. You're comfortable in this anchoring bias that this is what the story is going to be. And then when the birds come in, it creates this heightened level of stimulation. This is one reason it's, arguably, one reason it's so frightening is because it seems to come out of nowhere into this story type that is slipped into something more comfortable. But if you compare that to Birdemic, and the director of Birdemic, Mr. Nguyen, and I forget his first name, unfortunately, he has other movies where he does the same sort of structure, where it starts off as a romantic story, and then it shifts into something else entirely in the middle. So if you watch Birdemic, most of the beginning is this romantic movie with these really flat wooden actors, and the story seems to be about that, and then suddenly the birds show up, and they're really it's really bad special effects. So if you think about what really makes great special effects, that's a whole other issue. But if you were to say, Birdemic's bad because the special effects are bad, why are they bad? Because they're unrealistic. I don't know that is necessarily the pure defining quality of what good special effects should be. They're definitely unrealistic. If you looked at the birds and you broke apart those special effects and you said, a lot of them hold up fine, but a lot of them don't look so great. A lot of the blue screen looks really, really awkward. You would have to, dismiss most early movies, that rather fantasy movies or what have you. So I don't know that you could hang, your claims about quality on just special effects. Clearly, Birdemic has very, very low special effects. And it just, there's so many different forms of elitism that are really tied into this idea that The Birds is universally better than Birdemic, but Birdemic barely has any budget. So based on the budget, clearly, based on these artists with hope who didn't have a whole lot of money. I'm talking about a shirt that I got for free, and most of my shirts come from Goodwill and what have you. If you're criticizing an artist for not having a budget, and not having enough budget to make special effects look realistic, then that's an elitist position that, based on just the idea that great artists must have more money, which is an untenable position and a stifling position, and not one that I would recommend for anyone. That being said, if you look at something like, a Roger Corman movie or something like that, where he barely has any budget, but he puts a lot of heart into it, it's still entertaining. The special effects are bad, but it's still entertaining. Like the movie I referenced last time, Space Hunter. Space Hunter has really bad special effects. Space Hunter. It's really bad special effects, but I still love it. I think most people would probably call that a good bad movie, but I call it a great movie. But yeah, Roger Corman being the most famous example. He has really bad special effects, but he puts a lot of heart into it. You like the characters. The story it may be simple, but it's compelling and enjoyable. So the special effects is not, having a high budget is just a non-starter in terms of what really makes a movie genuinely bad. But Birdemic, you do have a schematic shift because you have the attack of the birds, but they're clearly not any sort of danger to the characters, because you set up, I would say, the level of realism to the birds in Hitchcock's The Birds flows from the level of realism earlier in the film, so that if you buy into the scheme of reality in the beginning of the film, and you buy into this schematic shift into something horrific, you buy into the reality of the characters being in danger, and that enhances the visceral stimulation. Whereas, at no point in Birdemic do you really buy into the scheme of reality, so you don't buy into the danger that the characters might be in. It undermines, the lack of consistency with the reality presented, anchored into the anchoring bias at the beginning of the film. That lack of reality flows into, characters who you can't really buy they're in danger. They go from reality in the first half to the supernatural force attacking them in the second half, and because we don't buy that they're really in love or anything other than actors in a movie, we don't buy in the second half that these weird CGI birds are actually endangering them. So the intended effect, presumably the intended effect, was to scare the audience. Um, uh, if it's imitating the birds, presumably that's what they were intending. Um, so the actual, the really bad special effects don't really function to enhance the fear, but it's viscerally stimulating because it's funny. These people pretending to see these obviously not their birds, and attacking them and with coat hangers and like a lot of weird choices that make it funny, like attacking them with coat hangers. But that's where that sort of secondary sympathy for characters like Natalie, who you could see as actors stuck in this weird situation. But then one of the main things to point out about the difference between birds and Birdemic, by the end of the birds, there's no explanation of why the birds attack, and that's something that enhances the fear of them. The schoolhouse. I didn't talk about the schoolhouse scene. I mentioned now it's one of the scariest ones, the scariest scenes that you can have. Once you establish, if you have the schema of reality and you establish the new schema that these birds are a danger, by brief little attacks from, like the seagull and things like that, you set up schematically that something that was otherwise normal, like a bird, is dangerous. You can build a really suspenseful scene like the schoolhouse scene where birds start landing one by one. And Hitchcock talks about, this is another interesting example of something I talked about before, which was Hitchcock says if you set off a bomb, that it's scary for a minute. But if you tell somebody there's a bomb and they're unaware of it, it extends the stimulation. And I talked about that with duration of stimulation. So if you're talking about duration of stimulation of if you're talking about what really makes a great movie, how do you really measure it? That's one of the few that you could call objective. People have remembered Hitchcock movies for so long because they're still able to stimulate after all of these years. I wouldn't say that's an objective good. I wouldn't say that's a proof that everybody in the world should love those movies. But that's one of the few objective measures that you have, is just positive response to a movie over decades. So duration of stimulation can be a relatively objective, it's not perfectly objective, but a relatively objective measure of just how successful a movie has been to stimulate an audience over a long span of time, like The Birds and Psycho and Vertigo, what have you. Compared to, there are a lot of monster movies that are totally forgotten that do some similar sort of things as The Birds. But how successfully they do that, you can't say one's objectively better, but you can objectively say that The Birds has continued to stimulate over the years. So it's tricky to parse through all these different permutations of what good and bad mean. But by the end, I was talking about the end, wasn't I? So the duration of stimulation. Oh, I was talking about the schoolhouse scene. The duration of stimulation. I can't blame the dogs on this losing track now because they're all asleep now. Maggie, are you asleep? She did not respond. Are you dead? This is a weird macabre game my son plays. When the dogs are asleep, he asks if they're dead. Maggie. She's definitely alive, but she's very, very asleep. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Hitchcock. Sorry. So the schoolhouse scene. So if you shift the schema, so you essentially associate this otherwise mundane thing, and you could probably do this with anything. If you shape it effectively, and I think The Birds proves that you can do it with anything. If you shift the danger to the birds, just the presence of the birds enhances the visceral stimulation. And that's something that the schoolhouse scene does really effectively. There's a lot of good scenes. I think that's one of the most effective. But Melanie is sitting outside the schoolhouse. And the presence of the kids in the schoolhouse also makes it extra terrifying because they're more vulnerable. That's sort of the role of vulnerability. Melanie has a degree of vulnerability, but I think a lot of her coldness makes her seem less vulnerable, and that's what makes her less effective. But the kids are definitely very vulnerable. So the vulnerability of the kids in the schoolhouse, the vulnerability of, the relative vulnerability of Melanie out in front of the schoolhouse, and the birds landing, one by one behind her, and then suddenly the jungle gym is full of birds. That sort of thing is, you can attribute it to schematic shifting from a reality where nothing is really in danger, that maybe the stimulation comes from the uncertainty of if the couple will end up together or what have you. You shift that to, suddenly really heightened danger, and that just accumulates over the course of the movie. But by the end, you don't have an explanation of why the birds are attacking. You just have the main characters driving away, basically. And that's, I would say, for that particular movie, that's the source of the continued stimulation. That's a source. That's a choice that enhances the ability of that movie to continue to stimulate audiences over the decades. And, it's what makes it still scary. And you can compare that. You can compare that with Birdemic, which Birdemic, the explanation is something global warming. There's more of an explanation. There's more rationality. And really, when you're looking at the end of a story where there can be an explanation. So I talked about this with Sherlock Holmes. Just the nature of a Sherlock Holmes story is that by the end there is an explanation. Schematically, that's what you're expecting. But that's really just the end. The explanation is not the purpose. The purpose of the story is to stimulate you through the mystery of who the murderer is. Trying to, it heightens your visceral stimulation by trying to figure out who the actual murderer is. So the explanation of who the murderer is not the point. It's just the end. It shuts down the visceral stimulation. Your stimulation is heightened by the lack of understanding of why, who the actual murderer is and why the person was killed or whatever. Sherlock Holmes explaining it is just putting an end to the story. It's not the purpose of the story, just the end. There's another cliche that I would rather people spread. And the opposite with the birds. The birds, there's no explanation, but there doesn't need to be. It's fine. You have a close of an arc because of that scene where Melanie and Lydia are sort of in contact. Lydia's injured and in the car with Lydia in the back seat, and they're sort of snuggling like mother and daughter. And so Melanie's actual problem, it doesn't end up being much of a romance after all, which is, I appreciate. That's great. But Melanie's actual problem turns out to be that she needs a mother figure, that her relationship with her mother was not good, was really bad. And that's sort of the problem that she actually has throughout the movie. And Lydia's problem is that she can't trust women with her son. And so you have a close of that arc. That's not the purpose of the movie to close that arc, but that's just the end of that arc. The stimulation is shut down. But you have the continued menace of the birds, and they drive away because presumably the birds are only in that small area. We don't get much of an explanation, but you don't have to. I think an explanation would have harmed that particular story. The explanation, it's hard to say the explanation harms Birdemic, because I think everything, arguably, subjectively, everything harms Birdemic. But the explanation is just one extra element of ridiculousness. But if you compare that to Psycho, I would say it seems like, from what I could tell, everyone's least favorite part of Psycho is it feels like 10 minutes or so at the end where the doctor is explaining what Norman Bates' problem is. It's a movie that ends with explanation. Norman Bates is, dressing like his mother because, of this particular condition. I forget what the doctor says. but it's like 10 minutes of explanation. And when people talk about what's so great about Psycho, they say, well, the shower scene is really terrifying because it seems to come out of nowhere. The scene of the cop getting killed. I'm forgetting all the characters' names in Psycho, but I should know this. But the scene of the cop getting killed and falling down the stairs. Scenes like that. The scene of turning the body around and seeing the mummified mother. Those are the scenes that people will say, those are the great scenes in Psycho. Nobody says, arguably. I'm sure there's somebody, like I said, I'm sure there's somebody who likes Birdemic better, but I'm sure there's somebody who may exist somewhere who says, my favorite part of Psycho, it's harder to imagine, but I'm sure it's possible. My favorite part of Psycho is when the doctor explains Norman's problem. That scene has this close-up of Norman, which is, fantastic. Acting by Anthony Perkins and all that sort of stuff. And the lighting and the framing of the shot and everything like that. Very creepy and terrifying and all that sort of stuff. But the actual explanation of why he did it, the rationale is not the source of stimulation for that movie. So that being said, I'll go ahead and wrap it up for today. I thought about talking about M. Night Shyamalan movies. I don't know if I've been pronouncing his name Shyamalan for so long, and I don't think that's how you pronounce it, and I'm really sorry. I thought about talking about his movies. I might have to do a different video. This is now over an hour. Because he imitates the birds a couple of different times in some really fascinating ways. In Signs and The Happening. Two movies that are fascinating to break down for so many reasons. That seems like it might be another hour-long video. So I'll just wrap it up for today. The dogs hardly even had any kind of cameo. And now Maggie's awake. Maggie, you want a last-minute cameo? Last minute cameo. Oh, here comes Seiko. Uh-oh. Here comes Seiko. Last minute cameo. You're in all the videos. You didn't get in this one. What's the deal? Last minute cameo. Seiko. They're not getting on my lap for once. Okay. The dogs! The dogs are attacking! Save yourselves! The dogs are attacking! Help me! Ah!